And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build. Ordinary men and women are too small-minded to govern their own affairs. That order and progress can only come when individuals surrender their rights to an all-powerful sovereign.
Another of our goals was to stop the Council from protecting the world's worst human rights abusers. What happened? The Council would not even have a meeting on the human rights conditions in Venezuela. Why? Because Venezuela is a member of the Human Rights Council, as is Cuba, as is China. Similarly, the Council failed to respond in December and January when the Iranian regime killed and arrested hundreds of citizens simply for expressing their views. When a so-called Human Rights Council cannot bring itself to address the massive abuses in Venezuela and Iran, and it welcomes the Democratic Republic of Congo as a new member, the Council ceases to be worthy of its name.
That is the ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, Donald Trump's ambassador, explaining why the U.S. is pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council. I couldn't help but think when I was listening to her saying, well, why didn't they investigate Venezuela? Because Venezuela is on the Human Rights Council. It made me think of Robert Conquest's third law of politics, which is the best way to understand any bureaucracy, is that it has been colonized by a cabal of its enemies. And isn't that incredible, the way she lists the violators of human rights that have actually infiltrated the Human Rights Council? Well, that's not news to our next guest, our friend Claudia Rosette, with the she's the Foreign Policy Fellow for the Independent Women's Forum, and she joins us now via Skype. Claudia, I know that you have known these things about the Human Rights Council for ages. It's sort of exciting to see the UN ambassador from the United States say the same things, isn't it?
Oh, it's refreshing. It's bracing. And you know something? I think it's actually quite good worldwide for the cause of human rights.
I think so, too. Now, here's a question. The United States has allies of different degrees of ardor. Do you think that this will spread to anyone else? Do you think any other countries that are more on the democratic side of the spectrum will say, yeah, you know, we're out of here, too. We don't need to give this place any dignity?
I certainly hope so, although that's really not the record. In fact, one of the things that Ambassador Haley mentioned in her terrific remarks, along with Secretary of State Pompeo, who also was really clear and terrific, excellent on this, is that America's allies who share our values refuse to stand up for them in public at the Human Rights Council. Behind closed doors, they may agree, but they won't. They just sit there and go along with it. She didn't actually name any individual countries, but if you look down the list of members, you'll find countries such as Germany, the United Kingdom, countries that share our values. Yeah. But again, America really fights this alone. Yeah. And I think is right to withdraw.
Well, I know the argument for staying in, which is, well, if we're in, we can have some influence. If we're in, we're part of the discussion. If we're in, we can maybe make some minor adjustments to their trajectory. Doesn't sound like that's working. I don't know. I think I think there's a real peer pressure, and it reminds me of other Donald Trump decisions, like when Trump removed the United States from the Paris Agreement on global warming. And this was something, oh, you can't do that. The earth will fall. The sky will fall, rather. And nothing happened. Like, Trump withdrew America from this UN process that makes the UN Human Rights Council look, you know, it's so dysfunctional, the climate change panel. It's so much larger, too. And nothing happened. The sky didn't fall. And I think that there's this peer pressure. You can't leave these institutions. No one's ever left these institutions. It's the jungle out there if we leave these institutions. No, you can leave these institutions and try something else, and it's not going to be a calamity.
No, in fact, there's this huge vested interest by these worst abusers in many cases. But the U.S., remember, the Human Rights Council is particularly bad at the UN. It's a magnet for the worst abusers because they exploit it to try and actually warp the definition of human rights. You get them arguing all sorts of things that are really out of Orwell. And they try to then sort of institutionalize that under the UN. And it got so bad. It was previously the Commission on Human Rights, you might remember, which ended up being chaired by Gaddafi's Libya in 2003. And the U.S. finally said, enough. The UN actually agreed and said, okay, we'll reform this. Then they produced the current Human Rights Council. The Bush administration said, in fact, with John Bolton as the ambassador who was there for part of this, said, no, we're not joining this. It's going to turn into the same collection of abusers. All the incentives are the same. And didn't join. President Obama then joined in 2009. And here we are finally, thank goodness, with President Trump saying, no, this isn't working. The incremental bits, the occasional good moment is not worth effectively endorsing the complete perversion of any definition of human rights.
Yeah. Well, I remember the last time I visited the United Nations building myself, and I was shown this absolutely exquisite lounge that faced the river, and it would have been like, if those were condominiums, they would have been like $10 million. Like that property is so amazing. And it was the most luxurious room I think I've ever been in my life. And I'm trying to remember if it was Qatar or the United Arab Emirates that had sponsored this room. Like, it was a plaque brought to you by, I forget which OPEC dictatorship. And what I learned then was, in the past, America says, well, we're footing the bill, we get to call the shots. But I realize now that if America pulls out, like when Donald Trump threatened to pull his funding away from the PLO, well, that's nothing for some OPEC dictator to come in with 10 million, 100 million. So it's not even the money anymore. And that's another worry, though, is that Trump could say, well, we're paying 3/4 of the bill or a quarter of the bill or whatever it is. I don't think there's any shortage of bad guys that would take over. And that would be the only one thing on my mind, is if America were to pull out of certain things, that America would be replaced by an odious force. Does that apply here?
Yeah, and at the same time, what America is also withdrawing is credibility. You know, if the UN, even with its current budget, were operating out of, say, Novosibirsk, Russia, it simply wouldn't have the effect that it does today. It's the U.S. backing. I mean, democracies carry credibility. They're legitimate governments. And when we withdraw that's important. Now, we still fund the base UN, where even if we don't fund, they say, the Human Rights Council, we're paying for the brand, if you like. We're paying billions, we the U.S., billions every year to keep the entire enterprise going, and attached to it are all these agencies where, whether we fund them or not, they thrive on the UN label. But when the U.S. starts pulling out and says, we're taking our business elsewhere, we want to promote human rights. We're not going to do it through this complete charade and mockery at the United Nations. We take away some of the legitimacy that is falsely attached to an outfit like the Human Rights Council. And I think that's, although you are certainly correct. OPEC dictatorships, sure, they could afford to bankroll most UN agencies. But what they want is the U.S. in there, not only paying for it, but blessing it.
Yeah. You know what? I sometimes daydream what would happen if the UN was actually physically moved from New York. I mean, I'm sure Putin would want it in Moscow. I'm sure, any Gulf, I'm sure they'd want to move it to Doha or Qatar. But I think taking it out of that wonderful city, New York, would knock it down prestige-wise. But that's, we should rejoice in this one baby step today. Hey, before we go, I want to ask you a little bit about North Korea, because you and I have talked about North Korea half a dozen times, and we were so perplexed, and we were so, and I've talked to Gordon Chang about it too, and we all thought it was such an intransigent, insoluble problem. And then look at Donald Trump and what he's done. I don't want to say that the deed is done, but I want to ask you if you believe that what is happening so far is real enough that we can at least have half a candle of celebration?
I'm incredibly wary. I don't think that Kim Jong-un has changed his ways, and I don't think that his great concern is developing a thriving North Korea where people are free. What I am hoping is that the real agenda here, or the real effect, will be a change of regime. Ideally, Kim Jong-un just goes. Perhaps that he is forced in some way to alter things to an extent where it basically is regime change. I think it would mean his downfall. But I think there are pieces of the puzzle we may not be seeing. And one of the big questions I have is, did President Trump find a credible way to threaten Kim Jong-un to such an extent, I mean, directly, perhaps through some message, perhaps through some set of targeting coordinates, I don't know, I'm guessing, I'm asking, that Kim Jong-un has a real incentive to comply with some of this. I don't think that Kim is going to cheerfully give up his entire nuclear arsenal and production facilities. I do think there's a chance here of maneuvering in some way to basically bring him down. And if that happens, we have the real start of a solution.
Yeah. Let me throw one thing at you. I mean, Donald Trump is criticized, certainly by the left and even some on the right, for his style, his braggadocio, his occasional vulgarity. And there's a theory out there, and some say it with respect, some say it with a grudging respect. He's such a bruiser, Trump. And he comes from New York real estate, where you're dealing with unions and corrupt regulators, and sometimes even in the past, I guess, the mafia. It's such a voracious, rapacious world that maybe his battle scars and his bully style that people criticize, maybe he's the first guy who has the temperament to take on a Kim. And I mean, the thing about Trump is you flick his nose, he flicks you back 10 times harder, as our own Justin Trudeau is discovering. And so maybe it takes the biggest, baddest, braggingest bully around to finally know how to deal with Kim. Maybe I'm saying the obvious here, but I think a guy who's a nice guy, like George W. Bush was, and I think Obama sometimes was, I don't think they had a chance. Maybe it takes a killer like Trump. I'm using that phrase metaphorically. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think so. In fact, I wondered, was this sort of the Godfather summit, a sit down in which a threat had been issued, and when President Trump said, we understand each other, was he sort of talked the way the Godfather would, we understand each other because we left a horse head in his bed before he came to have his chocolate cake. Yeah. But we don't know. We're really guessing on a lot of this. The thing I see is that I have thought for years that it's very likely that the only real solution to North Korea requires military action. No American president wants to do that. There's no appetite for another war in Korea. So they default to trying what they can with diplomacy. And what you just described with President Trump style, I think has a far better chance at succeeding than all the polished, refined, Ivy League, fancy diplomats who have paraded through the negotiations with North Korea over decades and failed catastrophically. Yeah.
I just don't think there's any person in the world who's older than like maybe grade 2 that John Kerry has ever scared. Like the former Secretary of State, John, like who would be afraid of John Kerry other than...
That's the problem.
And whereas Donald Trump, I think he could scare someone, and we're all sort of counting on that. We'll keep in touch with you on this too, but it was nice to have a little bit of a victory to talk about together, namely Nikki Haley pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council. So it's great to talk to you about that, and I just had to throw in some North Korea questions. It's nice to see you again, Claudia. I appreciate your time today.
Great to see you. Thanks, Ezra.
All right, you too. Well, there you have it, Claudia Rosette. A lot going on in foreign affairs, and Donald Trump is certainly at the center of all of it.
We want to end the border crisis by finally giving us the legal authorities and the resources to detain and remove illegal immigrant families altogether and bring them back to their country. We have to bring them back to their country. Now think of all that aid that we give some of these countries. Hundreds of millions of dollars we give to some of these countries, and they send them up. Well, I'm going to go very shortly for authorization that when countries abuse us by sending their people up, not their best, we're not going to give any more aid to those countries. Why the hell should we? Why should we?